Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle a phrase you've probably heard 1,000 times: survival of the fittest. Coined by Herbert Spencer, this famous idea has basically dominated our understanding of evolution for over a century. But according to some fascinating new research, if you take it at face value, well, it's actually a huge oversimplification. Because when you look really closely at how different evolutionary forces interact in the real world, it's not always the fittest who survive. Sometimes it literally all comes down to chance. Section 1. The deadly mating call, a high-stakes paradox. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture a scene straight out of a nature documentary. It's a full moon night in a dense Central American rainforest, right? The air is just thick with the sounds of wildlife. Now, consider this high-stakes paradox. What actually happens when the very traits that make you an evolutionary winner are the exact same traits that get you killed? How does nature reconcile that? Well, to answer that, we've got to look at the male Physiolamus pucellosus frog. So he's sitting in a puddle, trying desperately to impress a demanding female. And to win her over, he inflates and deflates his vocal sacs like a pulsating balloon, which creates these really intense ripples on the surface of the water. He is doing everything right, and he is well on his way to winning the mating competition. But there's a catch. Those propagating ripples unintentionally serve as a perfect target for an echolocating bat that's sweeping over the water. In a flash, the bat swoops down, so the impending winner of the mating contest, the one who successfully used his traits to attract a mate, dies because of natural selection. And the prospective runner-up frog, who is technically less attractive, he survives and ends up reproducing. His ultimate success depended entirely on pure chance. Section 2. Two forces of evolution: nature versus mating. Let's step back from our doomed frog for just a second and look at the broader biological why behind this deadly paradox. The core issue here is something called runaway selection. Basically, this is a positive feedback loop where a specific attractive trait is favored and not leads to increasingly extreme amplified variants of that trait over time. Charles Darwin himself actually struggled with this. In fact, the sight of a peacock's flamboyant feathers used to literally make Darwin sick to his stomach. Why? Because those massive bright feathers didn't seem to have any clear survival value. They just made the bird slower and way more visible to predators. It completely contradicted his theory of natural selection. And this actually forced Darwin to devise a secondary theory, the theory of sexual selection, just to explain why these extreme, seemingly illogical traits even exist. And this brilliantly illustrates the fundamental clash between these two evolutionary forces. See, natural selection operates on a negative feedback mechanism. It's stabilizing. It acts kind of like an invisible hand, where individual survival traits, like a hawk's sharp eyesight, also benefit the entire species. The interests of the individual and the group completely converge. But on the other side of the coin, we have sexual selection. This operates on positive feedback. It's a total arms race. It favors extreme traits to outcompete rivals for mates, even if those traits are highly destabilizing and super dangerous for survival. So the drive to survive and the drive to reproduce are just fundamentally at odds. Section 3. The evolutionary arms race, when forces collide. So what happens when these completely opposite forces collide? Well, you get massive systemic inefficiencies. Right in the middle of this clash is something called a Pareto inefficient equilibrium. Now, that's really just a fancy way of saying nobody is getting the best deal here. You have sexual selection driving animals to grow bigger and bigger weapons to fight each other, and then natural selection violently punishing them for it when predators arrive. It is the exact point of clash between these two pressures. To really wrap our heads around this, look at the elk's dilemma. The Cervus canadensis elk grows massive antlers. We're talking often over 4 feet wide and weighing more than 40 pounds. But their primary use isn't fighting off predators, it's interspecies combat. They're fighting other male elks for access to females. But having 40 pounds of bone strapped to your head makes you severely vulnerable to wolf attacks, especially in dense forests where you can, easily get tangled up. So here's the ultimate catch. Trimming every single elk's antlers by the exact same proportion would massively benefit the entire group's survival, but no individual elk can afford to do it, because doing so would completely ruin their own personal mating chances. So individual success severely jeopardizes group survival. Section 4. The collective action problem, individual versus group. Let's see how this biological clash actually mirrors human behavior and our own economic systems, because economists actually have a specific term for the elk's dilemma. They call it the collective action problem. This is a situation where an individual's interest in outcompeting their peers directly clashes with the overall group's interest, eventually leading to market failure.
Essentially, sexual selection in nature is the exact same dynamic as rent-seeking or runaway competition in an economy. When everyone is just fighting for relative status, massive waste is generated.
And we see this everywhere in human society. Think about hockey players back before helmets were mandatory. If given the choice, a player might refuse a helmet just to see and hear better, gaining a competitive edge. But that forces every other player to take off their helmet just to keep up, which drastically increases the risk of brain injury for the whole group. Or think about positional goods, like buying a luxury item not for its actual utility, but purely because it ranks you higher socially than your neighbor. Or even unregulated monopolies that crush competition to secure their own dominance at the expense of the broader market. If left unchecked, individual competition creates massive, massive risks for absolutely everyone involved.
Section 5. Talent versus luck. Measuring success.
Now, this brings us to a fascinating transition. How do we actually measure human success? Is it pure meritocracy? Well, let's look at the math. Mathematical models show that success over time is driven by two main components: percentage drift, which we can think of as a person's talent, and percentage volatility, which tracks random luck. And what's really interesting is that these models revealed there is an exact point in time where random volatility, luck, completely overrides skill. In complex systems with positive feedback loops, being just a little bit lucky early on compounds massively, completely overshadowing inherent talent. Which brings us to a fantastic quote from Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. He said, "Success equals talent plus luck. Great success equals a little bit more talent plus a lot of luck." And modern agent-based models conclusively prove this. When scientists run simulations of success, they find that the most successful individuals are rarely the most talented. Often, they possess just average talent, but have benefited from an extreme amount of luck. It's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? It completely challenges the very foundation of our meritocratic paradigm.
Section 6. Survival of the luckiest. The ultimate decider.
So, let's bring this to its grand conclusion, tying the rigorous math of human success all the way back to our doomed, love-struck frog in the rainforest. The crucial point here is this: survival of the fittest only makes sense if you assume natural selection operates in a perfectly isolated vacuum, where negative feedback cleanly aligns the individual's traits with the group's survival. But as we know, nature isn't a vacuum. Survival of the luckiest accounts for the messy, real-world interaction of natural selection, the arms race of sexual selection, and the highly unpredictable, stochastic randomness of the environment. Like a hurricane, or a bat flying overhead at exactly the wrong moment. When these forces collide, chance is often the ultimate decider. As the source material powerfully concludes, if we do not overlook the relationship between natural and sexual selection, the survival of the luckiest best reflects the condition of every living individual. Evolution is just fundamentally intertwined with random chance. It's not just about having the best genes, it's about being in the right place at the exact right time when the rules of the game suddenly shift. So, if pure meritocracy is a biological and economic myth, how much of your own success is just surviving the evolutionary lottery? Whether you're a frog avoiding a bat, an elk navigating a dense forest, or a human building a career, remember that the invisible hand is very often guided by a roll of the dice. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the patterns around you.